influencing popular culture, politics, and everything in between. The local station takes you ringside as we discuss the crazy world that is professional wrestling. This is Going Ringside with the local station.
Hello there, and thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Scott Johnson. This is another episode of Going Ringside. We're going to talk about that man, Thunderbolt Patterson, one of the most fascinating stories in the history of pro wrestling. Talked about it in just one moment. But first, go back and check out last week's episode. We had a lot of fun. Scott Steiner was here, said a lot of stuff our editors were working overtime to bleep out. Top Dollar, or AJ Francis, you may know better as today, he was here as well. But today, we're moving to a bit of a history lesson in the world of pro wrestling. I didn't know a lot about the history of that man, which is fascinating. His name is Claude Thunderbolt Patterson. So as you may know, we here at Going Ringside are affiliated with Channel 4 News in Jacksonville, News for Jacks. And for our news product, we are doing Black History Month stories all the time. We're doing a lot of them at our TV station. And when I was looking through interviews we had done, I was like, this is the interview we need to bring you in February. Because I did not know his story. I know a lot about wrestling, pretty much back when I started watching around 1983, 84 time. I was a kid. I didn't know what happened before that. You know, I know the stories, I know generally who was over, but I didn't really know the industry. I was not watching, I was not alive. So when I sat down with this guy, my eyes were open, I was fascinated. He had so much to say. As you can see, he's older now. You're gonna have to listen really closely when he talked to him. But I want to talk to you about who Thunderbolt Patterson is and was, because his story is one of civil rights in the pro wrestling industry. So often in society, we hear about civil rights in politics, in schools, general society, and a lot about sports, but we very seldom hear about it in pro wrestling. Wrestling gets ignored a lot. You know that if you're a fan. But for Thunderbolt Patterson, he was at the forefront of fighting for civil rights in the 1960s and 1970s, much of it in the South. Imagine being a black wrestler in 1972 or whenever it was in wrestling, in small high school auditoriums, armories, gyms somewhere, and trying to get equal treatment. He said it was rough. I didn't totally know the story. He enlightened me. So I want to tell you a little about who Thunderbolt Patterson is. Started in the 1960s, fought all the greats. I think he'll talk about here in this interview, Lou Thez. He dealt with Dory Funk, who's Terry Funk's father. So he dealt with all the greats. If you're a longtime old school wrestling fan, you've heard about. But something he was known for was speaking his mind, which in the 60s and 70s was a little tough. And he got kind of banned in a lot of pro wrestling because he did something that was a no-no. He did a few things. First, he pushed for more rights just for wrestlers, better conditions for wrestlers. The stories show he's involved in some sort of racial discrimination lawsuit and fought for more equal treatment for black wrestlers back in his day, which obviously, as you can imagine, may not have been well received by a lot of people. But he did one other thing that kind of got him just outcast in the industry. And I didn't know this. Fascinating story. Look it up. So if you know old school wrestling, before WWE was big, before Hulk Hogan had ever shown up, wrestling was a territorial-based system. You had the California territory down here. We had Florida. We had Georgia Championship Wrestling to the north. You had Mid-South. You had AWA up in Minnesota. You had a lot. So down in Georgia, in Atlanta, never heard this story. There was like a split over who should run that territory. There's a guy named Ray Gunkel, who Thunderbolt knew pretty well. I think he had worked for him. He was a promoter there. I think he passed away, and Ray Gunkel, in reading the old stories, his wife, Ann Gunkel, took it over. But she couldn't start a territory in Atlanta because NWA already had a territory. So there was kind of a turf war going on back then. She started what was called an outlaw wrestling territory. There was no real legal body of pro wrestling, but it was a big deal back then. And so she started this outlaw promotion. And so anyone who worked there, people wouldn't really, be happy with them. But Thunderbolt Patterson went to work there. So when he goes to work for an outlaw promotion, he kind of becomes an outcast in pro wrestling circles this is throughout the 1970s. Eventually he's brought back in, but he's called all these things he's fighting. He's fighting for racial equality in pro wrestling. He's fighting for just better working conditions, as he'll tell you. And he's in this outlaw territory. That's such a no-no back in the 1970s. Fast forward a few years, and I didn't know about this. And to my director, I will call for this graphic I want to put on the screen in a bit. Don't put it up until I tell you. So, if you remember, before there was Jerry Springer, everyone knows Jerry Springer, died not too long ago, had the talk show of the 90s, trash TV, people go on and argue, and it was, daytime television. Before him, there was a guy named Morton Downey Jr. Morton Downey Jr., I think, was the first crash TV daytime talk show host in the latter half of the 1980s. You probably remember Morton Downey Jr. because he had that face-off with Rowdy Roddy Piper at a WrestleMania where he kept smoking in Piper's face and Piper hit him with a fire extinguisher, like blew it in Morton Downey's face. Morton Downey was a very, very controversial daytime talk show host in the 80s. Think Howard Stern back in the day, think Jerry Springer back in the day. They all kind of got the start from Morton Downey Jr. If you go back and look now, and I'm going to show you in a minute some quotes from a show, he did a wrestler show. If you've ever seen wrestlers go on talk shows or news shows, kind of like this one, but maybe a little more extreme, they will go on and they'll start arguing. Wrestlers, they get paid to argue on television, and that's what they did. So if you go back and look at this old show, they had a few guests. They had Dr. D. David Schultz, that guy who slapped John Stossel, who asked if wrestling was fake in the 80s. I think he got sued for it, if I remember. I don't totally remember, but it's a famous clip. Dr. D. David Schultz, some people kind of say was the old Stone Cold Steve Austin in real life. Ted Arcidi, I think, was on. He's this huge, muscular guy. And you can go to Google, go to YouTube, it's out there, I found it, and I watched it. And you look up Morton Downey Jr., The Wrestlers episode. You'll find it. It's like 45 minutes, and it is a screaming match. You watch 40 minutes of them yelling back and forth about wrestling stuff, whether wrestling's real or fake or dangerous. And in this show, Claude Thunderbolt Patterson walks up to the microphone and starts talking. And he and Dr. D start going at each other. Thunderbolt is going up there talking about his push for equality in pro wrestling back in the day. So this is late 80s. He'd be talking about like during the 1970s and how he felt he wasn't paid enough. And if you watch it, here's the problem. So if you've ever watched daytime talk show where they all yell at each other, it's hard to know who's right or wrong because there's so much screaming. But I noticed some interesting things in the show, and I wrote down some quotes, which I want to show you, when he started at the microphone, Thunderbolt did, and he starts saying, I should be paid more than I was. I was drawing, and everyone said Thunderbolt could draw. People would go to see Thunderbolt Patterson. Love him or hate him, they would come to see him, but he was never getting paid, he felt, as much as he was worth. So they argued about that. I'm not to say who's right. Was Thunderbolt getting underpaid or overpaid? I don't know. But they fought, and it was fascinating to see how they responded to him. And I wrote down these quotes. You can go watch the whole show. It's out there on YouTube. But put it up on the screen right now. So these are quotes I wrote down from the Morton Downey Jr. Wrestlers episode. So Thunderbolt Patterson goes up. He's at the microphone, and this was one quote I wrote down. He goes, as a black individual, you were limited. It's that simple. So this is the late 1980s. He's saying this. Let's go to the next kick. Morton Downey Jr., the host. So if the host is against you, it's kind of hard. Morton Downey Jr. has passed away, but this is one quote he wrote when Thunderbolt was saying, I should have been paid more like $200,000, I think is what he said, $250, but he only got $100,000. Morton Downey Jr. pushes back on him. He says, seems to me anyone making $100,000 in the 1960s wasn't really discriminated against. So Thunderbolt's struggling at this point. He's got everyone against him. Then Dr. D. David Schultz. If you know Dr. D, everyone knows he would speak his mind, but he said this on national television, on a daytime mainstream talk show, yelled, just because you're black, you think somebody should kneel down to you. So these are the types of things in the late 1980s that are being yelled at on daytime television. And Thunderbolt Patterson is up there. I'm not there to say Thunderbolt, and you can come back to me on camera here, if Thunderbolt is right or wrong on, should he have been paid more? I don't know. I wasn't there. You can go watch the old episode, judge for yourself. But it was interesting that those were the quotes on that old Morton Downey Jr. show, and he mentions it. And keep in mind, going on a show like that in 1988, 89 was a big deal. It's not like today, if you go on a show and there's 5,000 channels and streaming and only a few people see it. Back in the day, a lot of America watched Morton Downey Jr., so a lot of people saw this at the time. Fascinating story. This is the story of Thunderbolt Patterson, a man who's still today, and he was brought into the WWE Hall of Fame just a few years back, but originally didn't want to. I think it had a lot to do with all the struggles he'd had. But he says people convinced him, and he was eventually put into the WWE Hall of Fame. So without further ado, here is our interview with WWE Hall of Famer. This is Thunderbolt Patterson. Well, we are joined today by legendary Hall of Famer, the man himself, Thunderbolt Patterson. Thunderbolt, thank you for joining us today.
The pleasure's mine.
When did it start for you? Back in the 1960s?
Back in Waterloo, Iowa in the 60s, yes. 1965 I got started.
Who were the star wrestlers when you started?
Well, that was from that Bob Geigel, Vern Gagne.
Vern Gagne, who eventually ran the AWA?
Right. Van Sean, Buddy Killer Austin, Big O, all of the older guys, Killer Kowalski.
What was it like to wrestle back then? It's not like the big glimmer and glitz that we see today.
Well, I've had the opportunity to wrestle some of the greatest wrestlers in the business of all time.
Like who?
All of them. Luthez, Gene Kiniski. I mean, all of them.
Yeah.
I mean, Valentine, Tanaka. I've had them. You name them.
Was life hard on the road back then, or did you enjoy it? What was it like?
Well, it was hard, away from your family a lot, away from your family a lot. But, you got to love to do it.
And you loved to do it?
Oh, yeah, I did.
What was it like to be a young African-American wrestler back in the 60s and 70s?
Well, now, since you asked that question now, just punch a button. You punch a button. I mean, I got blackballed.
You did?
Back in the years ago.
Why?
I went and worked for Ann Gunkel when Ray Gunkel died. Mm-hmm. All of those other individuals went back to work. So, anyway, they're still playing the race card, man. Come on.
They are?
Everybody, I mean, the world, you know. So why can't we just come together and, live in this great United States of America?
But in the 60s, was it different?
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't say that.
You wouldn't say it?
I was back there. I backed through it all. I mean, it's been bad from the get-go.
Yeah.
You understand what I'm saying? I mean, we're talking about a spiritual warfare from the beginning of time.
It's not new.
Well, it's real.
Yeah.
It's real, but don't nobody want to discuss or talk, find a solution to the problem. And then you have to have dialogue. You have to talk about things. I mean, don't nobody want to talk about it,
But you say you were blackballed for a while.
Well, I mean, you look it up.
Yeah.
Look it up. You check it out. Check the Martin Downing show years ago. Check what went down with it. I mean, the whole thing. It's all in the book. It's all in there.
All the Morton Downey stuff too.
It's all on television. Everything that happened is on tape.
I want to ask you about working with Luthez. Many people say toughest men ever.
One of the greatest that ever worked with.
Can you believe you worked with Luthez?
Pardon?
Can you believe you worked with him? He's one of the greatest ever.
Well, I mean, yeah, I worked with him.
Yeah.
I had that opportunity, and that was years and years ago.
How late did you work? How long did you wrestle? How many years?
Well, off and on. See, I ran against him in 1975. I was blackballed, and then every time that any territory would go down, they would call me in. Fritz sent me to Florida. They send me off to different places. You know, when places would go down, they come up, but then when they move them out. You know what I mean? See, I was hard to get along with because I took care of myself.
You don't view it that way.
Pardon me?
You didn't think you were hard to get along.
I mean, I knew how to wrestle.
Yeah.
I know how to wrestle, and it's a business.
Sure.
You know, and it's all about your money. It's all about that family wealth, Doc.
Yeah.
Is what it's all about. You know, I want to raise my children. I want to give my children $1 million when they were born, just like the rest of the people.
What did you think when wrestling turned into like all the glitz and glamour and stuff in the 80s and 90s? What did you think about that? Because it was different than your generation.
Entertainment. Entertainment, show business. It's all about Hollywood. It's all about the money.
And how did you get the name Thunderbolt?
Jules Strongbow. Los Angeles, California, Olympic Auditorium.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Alberto and Torres and I, we were West Choke champions.
And I see on your table Hall of Famer. What did it mean to you to be put in the Hall of Fame?
Well, at one time I said I wouldn't take it.
You did? Why did you say that?
Because he took the best of my life away.
Really?
Took the best of my wrestling ability away.
Yeah.
All my life, you know.
But eventually you decided...
God took me. God brought me through for this purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why did you decide to go in?
Why?
Yeah.
Because God sent some good people and talked me into it. It's a purpose. It's my purpose. I was chosen for this purpose of this wrestling business. You don't understand that, do you?
Yeah.
Do you really? It's deep now, man.
I understand.
See, don't nobody want to break that down. You got me?
I got you.
It's real, man. And you know, I mean, also imitated but never duplicate. You know, that's what it's all about.
And do you enjoy doing these events and still meeting the fans?
Well, this is, in the last 25, 30 years, it's about the fourth one I've done.
You haven't done a lot.
No. These are just a few.
Why did you decide to do this one?
Why? I was asked to.
Yeah.
Before then, I never was asked to.
Take it when they ask.
God's good.
Well, Thunderbolt Patterson, thank you so much for talking to us today.
The pleasure's mine.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor, sir. So I really appreciate Thunderbolt breaking this down, his history for us. A fascinating history, one that's often overlooked, but I definitely do not think should be forgotten. As far as I can tell, his active career kind of wrapped up early to mid-1980s. So I was wondering, you know, did things get better? So that's around the time Junkyard Dog took off as one of the most popular black wrestlers out there. I talked to Ron Simmons. We've had him on the show a few times. He talked about improvements. Ron Simmons is very outspoken on his history, of course. But one other guy I talked to about was Teddy Long. Teddy Long, the former SmackDown general manager, he was kind of making his bones in WCW in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and then obviously he'd gone on to massive fame in the 2000s. But I asked Teddy about that in an interview, which you can go look in the archives right now, and we plan on having Teddy on again shortly in coming weeks. Was he mentioned WCW, and he said there were issues with racism back in the day. This is what Teddy Long told me months ago here on Going Ringside. And I always wondered your character, particularly with Rodney Mack. You're on screen. Was that you turned up a notch, or was that?
Well, Vince knew what happened to me in WCW. Okay, and what I mean, what happened to me as far as the way that they were using me there. You know what I mean? Back in the day, the racism was out there. Okay? So Vince, like I did, when the man told me that they wasted me down there, he was telling me then. You know, I didn't understand it then, but as I kept going, I said, now I got it. Now I know why he said that. And that just went from there, man.
So interesting to hear that. He was talking about Vince McMahon for all Vince's faults that, you know, people accuse him of, and we've talked about in past episodes. He did realize the value of like an African-American performer like Teddy Long, saying he had been misused, as many in WWE, WWF called WCW, down south. That's how they referred to WCW and WA, down south. And Vince thought Teddy was misused. So he was still fighting for it today. And I've talked to people, they say it has gotten a lot better. Because of what guys like Thunderbolt did, I guess 50 years ago now? So it's interesting because, as I said at the top of the program, in the issue of civil rights, it is reported in schools, in society, in politics, in general sports, but seldom do we hear about it in pro wrestling. Guys like Thunderbolt is the reason why you see massive equality in the product today. So thanks for joining us on this episode of Going Ringside. I'm Scott Johnson. So glad you could be with us. We'll see you back here next time.
This has been Going Ringside with The Local Station, brought to you every Wednesday on your favorite podcast player, on News4 Jax Plus, as well as the News4 Jax YouTube channel.